When we were little and growing up, the village was a good half-hour's drive away, and you had to harness up your carriage and everything to get down there. In the early days, I remember my mother telling me when once one of my brothers, Ted, who'd been a very active little boy, and in the afternoon she picked him up and he put his head down on her shoulder, and she felt he was very ill, and she was a young mother. And to get a doctor, she had to send somebody down to the stable to harness a horse and to go drive down and tell the doctor, please come up. And the doctor came up. By that time, Ted was well and healthy again. He'd just been a little tired from an active day. But that was the kind of thing that happened, you know, in those days. It took a long time to get anywhere. It's difficult for us in 1970, this year, to realize how completely things have changed. The library was really the heart of the house, the most important room, because here my father was most of the time at his desk, reading, seeing people. But we came into it a good deal too, hurried in to impart some fascinating bit of information, such as there was a new calf in the barnyard or something like that. I always remember my father looking up at the portrait of my grandfather, Theodore Roosevelt, and saying he was the best man I ever knew. To look about the room now, I'd like to mention the rhinoceros foot, which came from my father's travels in Africa. He loved those ugly things and has them in various places round the house, rather to my mother's dismay. And that was one of our very early telephones. My mother didn't like telephones very much. It was rather sad when we had to have one put in, but of course we did. And we always thought one of the nice stories about that was when one of my brother's friends called up and asked to speak to Archie. And my father said, "So sorry, Archie isn't here." And the little voice said, "Well, who are you?" He said, "I'm Archie's father." And the little boy said, "Well, you do." And my father thought it was so nice that the President of the United States was accepted by this small friend of Archie's. The children especially will be interested in seeing that odd little animal under the table there. His name is Josiah. And my father, knowing how we liked to have things brought home to us whenever he could from his trips out west, used to bring us home treasures. One time he brought us a bear, which lived in the woodshed. This time he brought home a little badger. I took a picture of my brother Archie in his ordinary garb, barefoot, you know, with his little ragged trousers, holding Josiah, my father used to say, hissing like a tea kettle. And he had great holes in his stockings, you see here. And my father was running for office for something at that time. And one of the press looked at it and said, "I imagine he had those holes made there in his stockings." The books are everywhere in this house. In the bedrooms, they're in my mother's room, they're in the north room, they're in the halls, they're everywhere because we were all great book lovers. And, of course, they served as background and as when he was writing his many, many books, because if he hadn't made his living in any other way, he could have made it as an author. My mother's tastes were entirely different from my father's. She liked Alexander Pope, for instance. She liked the classic writers, really, in a way, far more than he did. And though he could read French and German and Spanish, almost all kinds of languages, he didn't speak them, and she liked to speak French, for instance, and has a great many French books. She loved plays, she loved the Japanese no drama, all that kind of thing. The drawing room is very different from all the other rooms of the house, and it reflects my mother completely. She really never cared a great deal about heads. In fact, she didn't at all about heads and skins and all that. She did make an exception here because this wonderful polar bear was brought to her by Admiral Peary on his voyage to discover the North Pole. My mother liked having her friends come in to see her to tea. Very often there was a child sitting in the little chair there, not necessarily taking part in the conversation, but just glad to be there and reading their own little book. The North Room was built when my father was president because the house wasn't large enough to contain all the things that had to go on here. This room brings back memories of the Russo-Japanese War. My father was asked to be the arbitrator for that. They met here at Sagamore Hill for the beginning of the discussions. I think my father had a good deal of experience with groups who differed widely in their beliefs, and I think he kept one group, say the Russians, in here while he talked to the representative of the Japanese delegate in his library, and then would change and bring the Russian in, and then eventually they'd get together. Do look on the elk head to the left, and you'll see my father's Rough Rider hat and his binoculars hanging from it. Spanish War, we weren't really old enough to remember all that was going on. But I do remember so well when my father came home from it and the rapture that we all had to see him again. There was a great open space and the men in the middle of it, and they there presented my father with this wonderful Remington bronze called the Bronco Buster. And he also liked very much the one on the right, the rhinoceros. This was given my father by his sister, and he liked it very much indeed, not so my mother. On the rhinoceros's back are the little tick birds which warn it of danger, and on those little tick birds she had all the messages, the telephone messages from the waiting for the family, so that it was always covered with little pieces of paper, and generally on its right horn, its big horn, hung my mother's hat. I've told you about the meetings. Oh, I don't think I have. This was the room in which we always gathered after dinner, and my father always had his guests. But we children, it was used for us too, and every year at 4th of July, we had a 4th of July party for all the neighborhood, and the rug was taken up, and we had music, and I always remember doing the Virginia Reel, and my father and mother at the head of the line dancing with us. If you will look at the dining room entrance, you will see a wonderful gong made from my father's elephant tusks. You'll understand that even if we were up in the gun room at the top of the house, we could hear the gong, and we would all tumble downstairs as quickly as possible. Breakfast was at 8 o'clock, I think, and there were strict rules about that you could be as much as 10 minutes late, but if you were more than 10 minutes late, you had to wait for an hour. So 8 minutes past 8, there'd be a great deal of activity in the staircase, everybody hurrying down to get into their place. We all came to the family table very young, and the youngest one sat on either side of my mother, and then later on they sat beside my father. We weren't a quiet family, and there was a great deal of conversation that went on at the breakfast table. We all knew my family would be interested to hear what we'd been doing. We were interested to hear what they'd been doing. Nobody ever had breakfast in bed in those days. I never remember anyone having breakfast in bed, ever. When we were little, we used to always come in here and sit at the little table by the side there and be stayed with cups of tea by our Irish cook, and mid-morning, what they call now, snacks. In the old days, the speaking tube were one's only way of getting messages to and fro. I don't think there were bells, even. It was obvious that it was great fun to go and, if there was nobody in the kitchen, to go and blow into one of those and then remove oneself as quickly as possible. The first bedroom is my sister, Mrs. Longworth's, and this is all the furniture that was there, which she gave to us later on. And there are all the things that she had here in this room. Over the desk, there's the picture of her mother, Alice Hathaway Lee, and who died so tragically when my sister Alice was born. And then, after my father married, then we were the five of us, were the children of Edith Carew. Over her mother's picture, you'll see Alice in a white linen coat and a lovely great hat. My brother Quentin had a hideaway there, and which we all used to cherish because it gives on a roof, that little room, and there was a ladder we kept up to the roof, and it was always a way of escape if danger threatened us in the form of guests or people we didn't want to see. We always could streak out there and go down over the roof and escape into the cornfields below. This at one time was used by many of my brothers, because as anyone with a large family know, you begin in the nursery and then you become semi-independent and then independent and then completely independent when you're off and don't have to be listened for at night. And this room shows a great many of their tastes. You'll see all kinds of sporting things because the boys were a very energetic lot. We all were, but of course the boys played hockey and they played games called jeu de bar on horseback, and kind of polo, and they played many sets of tennis. But there was a great deal of outdoor life. I suppose we were outdoors as much as we were in. And then we had a great many expeditions when we spent the night out. Sometimes the boys by themselves down by the beach, and then once a year my father used to take us all on a great expedition, boys and girls, and we'd go and spend the night on the lonely beach across on the other side of Cold Spring Harbor. And after dinner he would tell us these wonderful ghost stories, which thoroughly prevented us going to sleep at night. All the people on the neck here, there were three families, large families of Roosevelts, and then there were 3 or 4 other large families, and we all were very much to ourselves. We all played games together, we went on expeditions together, we sailed together, you know, and it was a delightful, very easy, because we got together by foot. We used to play tennis in a tennis court down the hill. We used to go swimming and bathing from either side on Oyster Bay or Cold Spring Harbor. We had axes, we all went off chopping, all of us. We used to go off on these incredible all-day expeditions. This room, everything had a habit of coming up here when it was old and comfortable and too shabby to keep downstairs. Father in old days used often to write too, but he did not use the typewriter because he didn't know how. But that was one of his secretaries who used that for him. Many things in this room which remind you of the West, not only of the chair in front of the desk, but the heads, and then a great many guns. My father always used to tell us many stories up here, hunting stories and all that. This was primarily my father's room, the boys' room, for their rifles and all. We never had very much to do because we didn't clean rifles. When my father went out to North Dakota, he was at once made a justice of the peace. And it was a little difficult for the cowboys to realize that he felt the Indians had just as much to be protected from as the cowboys. One of the Indians had had a pony stolen from him, and when my father returned it to the Indian. He said, how? And then he came back in a few days and dropped this skin at my father's feet, and on it was this extraordinary representation of Custer's last stand. We weren't here a great many winters because my father was always off, civil service commissioner or governor, or again in Washington, or perhaps in New York for the winter. But when we were here, this was our schoolroom upstairs, and on your right is the little stove which we used to use. At this stage of our career, we were generally working for a wonderful English governess, Miss Young. But later on, when we had more serious and more advanced studies and used to get into difficulties, my father used to take time off and coach us. I remember one year when one of my brothers was jumping a class and going ahead, he did practically the whole outline for him, and he did it so succinctly and so graphically that we never, any of us, had any difficulty remembering what period he was exploring. In my father's and mother's bedroom, you'll see around the room all the little things that go to making a room a happy family place. The little chair where we used to sit beside my mother when she was lying down in the afternoon. In this room, we celebrated the beginnings of Christmas. We all used to wake up very early, and then we'd all come in here, and the fire would be blazing, and all our stockings would be laid out, and we would take them from in front of the fireplace and go and sit on the family bed and open our stockings. But I think we liked the stocking presents almost as much as anything. We always used to have a cornucopia of candy for each one of us. This was the room that the children occupied when they still had to be contained, and this made the room a giant playpen, as you can well imagine. And as you see, it has a collection of things here, all the way from the little wash basin which they had, the crib in the corner where the young ones first were put, to the different toys. The doll in the rocking chair to the right was always known as Clara Doll. For some reason, my mother valued her very much. She'd been in my mother's family, and she never came down except on Christmas, when she appeared sitting in a chair below the Christmas tree. You'll see the large teddy bear over there and a rather smaller assortment of them about the room. That was a very popular play toy in those days, and it apparently all came from a time when my father went down shooting in Mississippi. And there was an incident with a bear, some say with an old bear, and some say with a cub, which he refused to shoot. Newspapers told all this story, and from that, the manufacturers picked it up and made a bear, which they called the teddy bear, and which has preserved its popularity, I think, until this day. Just to the right of this doorway is a portrait of my brother Quentin at the White House, and that shows you how little boys were dressed in those days. And he really did have a bow and arrow, and he did like it. And he was always the gayest and the merriest of youths, and you'll see pictures of him downstairs in my mother's drawing room. And he had a great bent for mechanics, and he was always tinkering about with motor cars, so it came natural for him to be interested in aviation. And he joined our Air Corps and was shot down over fighting in France in 1917. This room connects with the family bedroom. When my father was ill, he slept in here, and it was in this very bed and in this room that he died. Quite peaceful and tranquil, and I think James Amos, the butler, was with him at the time, sitting up with him at the time. My mother used to in the winter a great deal after my father died. He used to often sit in the afternoon and look across the Sound. Porch, or the piazza as we used to call it, and that's the great centre of family doings, and also it was where my father used to welcome all kinds of groups who came here to see him, whether they came to notify him for a nomination or to ask his advice, or or whether it was the Boy Scouts who came. They used to stand below the piazza, and he would stand on top and address him, and I think there is a recording.
It is a privilege to present to you an address by one of the foremost heroes in American history, 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States. I wish to see you boys act as good citizens in the same way I'd expect any one of you to act in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, and hit the line hard.
We held him in great respect, my father.